Well, in comparison with President, just President Davis, and not, so you won't say that I am.
Thank you for recognizing him as president.
Well, I put the adjective in front so that we would know that we're talking about him. In comparison, Lincoln was a people person. He could relate to people, whereas Jefferson Davis was a book person. He could speak to people, but he could quote from books, but he had a hard time doing and working with them. In fact, did he not take money out of his own pocket when he was having problems with the crowd wanting bread in Richmond and just throw it out to him? So he really couldn't relate to him. How President Lincoln would have handled it, I don't know. But he was a people person, and he could tell stories that would get people to think a little bit. So President Lincoln was more of a people person in comparison to Jefferson Davis, who was a book person.
General Grant, why do you think Mr. Lincoln chose you as commander of the East, as commander of the Army of the Potomac?
Well, there's several stories, and one that comes to mind was that he made the statement, I can't, he fights, so I need a general and he fights, is one of the statements that were said. There's been other stories that are going around about my drunkenness, that when I had victories, find out what he's drinking and I'll give it to all my generals. Perpetuating my alcoholism.
Now you mentioned the terrible experience you had the first day at Shiloh, and how your subordinate, your Lieutenant Sherman, I'm sorry, told you what a terrible day.
Yes.
That had been a devil's own day, and yet all you said was, "We'll get him back tomorrow."
Yes.
How do you explain that remarkable equanimity? Was it just the whiskey talking?
It was not whiskey. One of the things that I do when I am thinking is whittling. And as standing underneath that oak tree, I was whittling and thinking how I could go back after my opponent. Because one of my judges is that war is find out where your opponent is, go after him, and go after him often. And one of my superstitions was, once that you start something, you don't go back and step around it. You continue on your journey until you're there. And luckily, in my case, it did occur, and we did come back where he went.
If I might impart, I doubt that General Grant would have been as successful in his efforts toward our Army if he woke up with a headache every morning. I just don't think that's the case.
Well, one more question for you, sir. You mentioned Gettysburg earlier. Why, when you had this long string of victories in Virginia, and the Confederate cause seemed on the verge, at least in the popular press, of carrying the day, did you decide to strike out into northern country, across the Mason-Dixon line, and go in the vicinity of Gettysburg?
Well, you mentioned two reasons. You said long string of Confederate victories and on Virginia soil. Well, that's exactly where all the battles have taken place, on Virginia soil. And, you know, if you take our Army, which ranged anywhere from 50 to 75,000 men, and the Army of the Potomac, which ranged anywhere from 75,000 to 120, 130,000, and they're all living on Virginia soil. You know, if you take an army, a corps, we used to travel, when the Army was out moving, if we were headed toward the same spot. No, all three corps could not travel on the same path at the same time. If you take 75,000 soldiers and march up this particular path right here, by the time all 75,000 are gone through there, there's going to be absolutely nothing left. And so you would split up the corps. You'd take one corps here, two corps here, three corps here. And the reason you did that is because when that corps passed through a particular area, everything was gone. The snake rail fences were chopped up and used for wood. The wells were drained. The highways were absolutely impassable. And all this takes place now. This had gone on in Virginia for 2 years. So Virginia, by the summer of 1863, Virginia was as barren as this carpet is. There was nothing growing. Most all of the livestock was gone. Even wild game was pretty much gone. So we figured if we could go into Pennsylvania, we could garner supplies, which were badly needed, not just for people, but for the horses also. That's one of the reasons, because all the battles were in Virginia. Now, we had been successful on numerous occasions prior to that. Chancellorsville was a great victory for us, and Fredericksburg, and Antietam, Sharpsburg, whatever, however you want to refer to it. While some people say it was a Union victory, and I know Mr. Lincoln claimed it as a Union victory so he could issue the Emancipation Proclamation. At best, it was a draw. So, and all these different things have been the morale of our troops was at its highest level ever. By the same token, the morale of the Union forces was at its lowest level. And not just the Union forces, but so was the Union population. That was a low level. They had gone through this string of losses, and so they were demoralized. The folks in the European theater, we felt, and the messages that we received encouraged us in our move into Pennsylvania, because we felt that if we had a significant victory on northern soil, then they in turn would come into the contest on our side. Another fact was that General Grant was in Vicksburg at that time, and he had our General Pemberton hold up in Vicksburg. And one of the feelings was that if we were to press into the north, Mr. Lincoln would have no recourse but to take some of the troops away from Grant to come after us because of the threat that was on Washington City. So there's a number of reasons why we did it. And obviously, as I mentioned before, we did disrupt their efforts for the balance of the year, and it obviously turned out, we didn't recognize it at the time, but obviously it turned out to be a turning point in the contest.
Did you want to add something to that, General, before we open the floor to questions?
Well, he had the morale was something that he was trying to also affect by going up into the north, because that was actually the first major battle that had taken place on northern soil. We also had at this time some people in New York that were rioting about ending the war, and you also had the bankers who were involved into it that wanted to still capitalize on the money. But as he said, I was at Vicksburg. It was a siege. So when we came to, when I came west, one of the things that he really didn't want me to do was to create a siege situation for him, because we had Vicksburg, we had closed it off.
That was the problem, Jim. You didn't come west, you came east.
Oh, I'm sorry, in the west, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Hopefully you won't get me confused again when I come across.
Now, gentlemen. General Grant, please continue.
Oh, well, Vicksburg, as you know, is in a hairpin turn. It sits up on the top of a bluff, 200 feet, and you can see for a great distance. And we had to get to it. And the only way to do it, we tried to come from the north, or we could come from Jackson and come across this way. So finally, we even tried to dig canals to get around so that we didn't get in a hairpin turn. We even tried to take our boats down, and we put bales of hay and cotton in front of the smokestack so they couldn't see it. And they were having a cotillion in Vicksburg. And when they saw that we were coming, they started tearing off the sides of houses and burned so they could see us and started shooting. We did lose 2 boats, but luckily the casualties were very low. Finally, we did get below, and Pemberton did go ahead and decided that he would surrender. And it was at the same time that General Lee was having his conflict in Pennsylvania. So on July 4th, there were 2 victories. So.
Thank you, General. Certainly we recognize that you're not only a master of, not only a believer in the frontal assault and the willing to sacrifice troops, but as you proved at Vicksburg, a master of maneuver as well. Let's take some questions from our audience this evening. Sir, the gentleman in the white shirt.
I'd like to talk about the Melbourne campaign and General Lee, from your standpoint. Use that.